Hello, welcome back to the 7th week of the Jerusalem Science Contest. This week we're going to be looking at chapters 16 and 17. Chapter 16 is paint analysis. Chapter 17 concerns itself with soil and glass analysis. And there'll be 10 questions on the exam from the chapter on paints, and another 10 from soil and glass, and the final 5 from this, what I hope will be a relatively short talk today. So I've chosen paint. I think it's a little bit more interesting than what I would have to say about soil and glass analysis. I mean, it's a more complex type of material. It's got a pigment in it. It's got a number of materials that are used as binders. A lot of this you'll find just in your reading of the chapter, but for instance, when we're dealing with something like the painting of a car, you find that there's actually 4 coats that go on. There's a pre-treatment coat, there's a primer, there's a top coat, and then there may be actually two different coats. One of them is going to be a color layer, and then there's a protective layer, a clear layer that goes above that. So when we're actually dealing with paint analysis, there are a number of different techniques that are used, in addition to the common things like microscopic examination. We've seen in the book that you can use polarized light microscopy. You can use solvent and microchemical test. I mean, just putting a paint chip into a solvent, it will sometimes partially dissolve, or it will curl. There are various kinds of physical changes that occur, and these things are readily discernible, and will give you some idea about the type of paint that you're dealing with. We also can use pyrolysis gas chromatography, Raman spectroscopy, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, and scanning electron microscopy, coupled with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, which is another technique that we haven't really said very much about. But all these things will enable you or will enable the forensic analyst to be able to understand something about the chemical composition of the paint. But there are a couple other techniques that are not mentioned in your book that I just wanted to briefly cover, and one of them that's not in the text is fluorescence microscopy. And in this case, you're using a specially equipped microscope and basically irradiating the surface that you're looking at with a 365 nanometer, that would be shortwave ultraviolet light. Actually, it's not really shortwave. It's probably in between short and long wave, probably closer to long wave light. But the point is that when you do this, there are organic pigments usually, if there are organic pigments, I should say, and even some inorganic pigments will actually fluoresce at that wavelength. But mostly it's organic ones. But additives and film-forming compounds that are of organic origin will frequently be fluorescent. And by using this particular technique, a very simple technique, it's sometimes possible to ascertain what kinds of materials might be in the paint before you do some more extensive testing. Now, another technique that's in there besides fluorescence microscopy is low temperature ashing. And it's unusual that this would be considered low temperature because what is actually used to do the ashing is usually an oxygen plasma, which I would think would be kind of a high temperature technique, but apparently it's not, and at least the way it's employed here. And the idea is, unlike pyrolysis, which would be a much higher temperature technique, volatile organic compounds that are present in the paint matrix are going to become oxidized, and the remaining materials and these oxidized materials are just going to actually leave the matrix, and then the remaining non-volatiles can be analyzed by some of the other more traditional techniques where the volatile organics might actually interfere with their analysis. So you could use the scanning electron microscopy, energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy technique that we mentioned before. You could also use what is known as analytical electron microscopy. And analytical electron microscopy actually refers to a technique that employs tunneling electron microscopy in conjunction with selected area electron diffraction, and again the energy dispersive X-ray analysis. And you could also use X-ray dispersive spectroscopy or polarized light microscopy as techniques that could be employed after the low temperature ashing. So all these things are actually part of what is sometimes referred to as analytical electron microscopy. And the third technique, which is different than any of the others, is called cathodoluminescence. And cathodoluminescence is a technique in which cathodic electrons are accelerated using an electrical field, and they're accelerated to high speeds and high energies, and they will strike an insulator or semiconductor. In this case, it's going to be a filler or inorganic pigment that is in the paint itself. And when that happens, they'll actually emit visible light that can be detected using specially equipped optical and scanning electron microscopes. So these are techniques that are frequently used to augment the other techniques that are described in your book. And basically, what I really wanted to talk to you about now are just some case studies. I've got 5 various case studies that actually have to do with, most of these are fairly serious kinds of things, but we tend to think mostly of paint being used in cases of like hit and run accidents, and the other thing is it frequently comes into to use when we're dealing with things like burglaries, because the tools that burglars will use, sometimes if they're using a pry bar, that will become contaminated with the paint from whatever it is that they're prying, and we can find evidence of that on the pry bar. So those are the areas where we most usually see this kind of thing. But I wanted to talk about some very serious cases. One which actually comes from the British system, and there was a serial rapist who was actually, I'm not sure exactly when he was caught, but he was actually active during the 1970s, and his name was Malcolm Fairley, Fairley, and he was known, I guess, to the British press as the Fox. And basically, there have been a number of rapes that were committed, and they all seem to be to have the same modus operandi, and police really could not actually identify who it was that was doing this thing. But it turned out that at one crime scene, they found some yellow paint on a tree, and it turned out that when they actually took the paint back to the lab and analyzed it, paint analysis is so good at this point in time that it's possible to actually look at a paint and to be able to tell usually from what car, what type of car that paint actually came from. So if there are enough differences within the compositions of different paints that and enough of these have been studied thoroughly, that it's possible to actually pin down the car. And if you have other evidence, which we'll see in another case, it might even be possible to find the year of the car. So in this particular case, the analysis showed that the car was an Austin Allegro, and the Allegro, at least in England, was a car that it wasn't a car where there were many hundreds of thousands of these things sold. So they found out that there was a relatively small number of these cars. I mean, it numbered in the hundreds, I think. And once they realized that it was an Austin Allegro, they actually got a list of everybody that in that area who actually had purchased an Allegro during a certain time period. And since they knew that the paint was yellow, that enabled them to also narrow it down even further. So they were looking for a yellow Allegro, and they interviewed a number of people that owned Allegros, and finally they came across this individual, Fairley, and as they approached him, he actually was cleaning this yellow Allegro that was in his driveway. And the police examined the car, and they found that there were scratches on the car, and the scratches actually matched paint flakes that were found at the crime scene. And based on this evidence that was obtained, Fairley was convicted, and he was sentenced to 6 life sentences for rape, assault, and burglary. There was another case that occurred in the United States, and again, this was something that happened. These were murders that actually occurred in the 1970s and 1980s, and there were 50 to 90 women who were actually murdered by this one individual. So this was a real serial killer, and he dumped their bodies into the Green River, which was located in the Seattle, Washington area. So there was an individual that was a suspect, but there was actually insufficient evidence to hold him, and this became a cold case through the end of the 1980s and the 1990s, and then somehow, I'm not sure exactly what resurrected this, but in 2001, somebody actually went and looked at paint that was on clothing of one of the victims. And when they actually did a very thorough paint analysis, they found that it was a very highly specialized kind of paint, and they were actually able to track it down to a particular plant. It was a truck plant called the Kenworth Truck Plant. And this individual, who had been previously was a suspect, actually worked at that plant. So with that evidence, and also DNA evidence that they collected from him, and matched that with DNA evidence that they found at the crime scene, Gary Ridgway, who was known as the Green River Killer, was convicted for murder in 2002, and he's currently serving 48 life sentences. So it's unlikely that this individual is going to be getting out anytime in the near future. Now, here's an unusual case that occurred sometime not terribly long ago. It was just a routine burglary, nothing very unusual about it, except that this was interesting in that when the burglar was actually apprehended and caught, and because of the analysis of the paint, there was another individual who probably would have gotten away scot-free if it hadn't been for the fact that this burglar had broken into into this apartment building. This other individual, who was a contractor, who painted the apartment building with a lead paint, which was not something that one could legally do. And anyway, it turned out that the burglar was caught. He was found loitering around the apartment building, and they found a pry bar that had paint, which obviously came from the apartment building. But when they analyzed the paint, they found that the paint had a lot of lead carbonate in it. So lead carbonate is a white pigment that used to be used. It was a very common pigment that was used to paint houses. And it turned out that this particular contractor who painted the apartment had this old lead paint that was around. He didn't want to throw it out, and he figured he wanted to bid cheaply on the job, and he had a lot of this paint. So rather than throwing it out, he decided he was going to use it. So anyway, the contractor then got in trouble, and he was fined and forced to make restitution and repaint the house. and he ultimately went into bankruptcy as a result of that. A woman who was struck, her name was Marjorie Cordero, and she was fatally struck by a car in Greenvale, New York. And this was a hit-and-run accident. So the driver flees the scene, and this time forensic investigators find parts of a broken taillight, and they also find paint both on Marjorie Cordero's body and also other paint chips around the scene of the hit and run. So from this, they were able to actually ascertain from the broken taillight that it belonged to a Mercury Cougar, and it was black paint. So they knew it was a black Mercury Cougar, and it was they were able to figure out that that particular paint was only used between 1987 and 1988. So they determined that there were 800 cars that were sold in that area during that particular period of time, and the police actually started to track down all the cars. And after they examined about 300 of them, there was a car that belonged to a Robert Michels that was located, and he was arrested and tried for leaving the scene of a fatal accident, and he was found guilty. And the last one that I wanted to mention was a young girl. This was not a hit and run. It looked like it might have been because they found once they actually found the car that was involved in this, they found on that car they found paint that actually matched this young girl's bicycle. She was driving a bicycle that was painted pink, and they found some of the pink paint from her bicycle. But it was, for a while, it was a missing person case. This young girl, 8-year-old girl, was missing. Her name was Vicki Lynn Hoskinson, and her parents were very, very distressed about this. And the police looked all over for her, and they interviewed a lot of people who claimed to have seen a car that was leaving the scene, and they gave some descriptions of the car. But ultimately, based on that, and again on the paint that they actually found on her bicycle, they were actually able to arrest and convict an individual by the name of Frank Atwood. Now, Atwood apparently had some other run-ins with the law, and he might have been somebody who kidnapped young children and sexually molested them. It's not really sure exactly what his plan was here, but there was also a woman. He had a female accomplice that was involved in this as well. And unfortunately, Vicki Lynn Hoskinson's body, her decomposed remains, were found in the woods on April 12th of 1985. Atwood was indicted for first-degree murder on March 26th of 1987, and he was sentenced to death. His case, after all these years, is still under appeal. So this guy is still languishing in prison. But the point of all this is just to illustrate to you that there are that paint can be a very, very important clue that enables forensic investigators to tie individuals who otherwise might not ever be caught to a crime scene. And there's one other thing that I wanted to talk about, which doesn't come up so much, and that is actually paint analysis that could be used to determine when there's art forgery that's been committed. And it turns out that up until about the year 1500 CE, painters used to use when they of course mix their own paints, and they would take a pigment, and the pigments were ground up minerals that were colored, and they would use egg tempera as a binder for these pigments. And after about 1500, sometime after that, then they started using, instead of egg tempura, they started using linseed oil and walnut oil and poppy oil used as a vehicle for the pigment. And sometimes there were a few organic pigments that would be used. These would be derived from plants, for instance. But basically, if somebody was forging a painting, for instance, even if their style was very, very good, modern forensic analysis could show whether or not these oils had been used or something like egg tempura was used. So if you had something that was purportedly painted in the 14th century and you saw that there was linseed oil or one of these other oils in it, that would undoubtedly indicate that this was a forgery, because those oils were not in use in that time. There was a German forgery ring that in the 20th century was exposed when paintings that were supposedly created prior to 1920 by some famous artists were found to contain titanium white. This is titanium dioxide, TiO2. And this pigment was actually, although it was known prior to that time, it had never been used until for actual paintings. It had never been used prior to 1921. So that was something that was used to actually find that these people were selling these bogus forgeries. Forgeries go back to a very long period. Go back a very long period of time. And in 1496, no less an artist than Michelangelo himself actually created a figurine. It was a Cupid. And although this wasn't painted, I'm just illustrating this to show that even very famous artists are involved in forgeries. And what he did was, with this Cupid figurine, he treated it with acid in order to make it look like it was ancient. And he ultimately sold it to a Cardinal Riario. And somehow Riario found out that it was that this was not an ancient statue, but something that was contemporary with his time, and he demanded his money back. It's kind of unfortunate for Riario's family, if he had any family, that their heirs didn't still have that statue, because undoubtedly that particular Cupid figurine, even as a forgery made by Michelangelo, would probably be worth millions of dollars today. There's also a painting that's entitled Portrait of a Woman, and this was purportedly painted by Goya, and X-ray diffraction of this painting revealed the presence of zinc oxide as a pigment. And zinc oxide was not invented until after Goya's death. There's other examples. There's a pigment called Prussian blue that was found in a painting that was supposed to be very, very old, maybe 14th century or 13th century. And Prussian blue, which is a ferric ferrocyanide, did not come into use until a much later period of time. So again, we can use chemistry to reveal forgery in art, and there's a number of different, not just chemistry, but other techniques, other forensic techniques that can be used. So that's all I really have to say about paint today. So it's a little bit shorter of a lecture than I've done before, but we'll be talking about some other interesting things in the remaining 3 weeks. And again, I thank you for your attention.